Alan Davidson. I'm one of the staff of the Handmade Network, bringing you our regular show, Unwind, every third Saturday of the month, except for next month. Next month, we have the Learning Jam, and that is, let me check my notes here, March 15th through the 17th for the first session, and March 22nd to the 24th. More in the chat. You can go find, should be a link there soon. That is pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to that. This month, we've got our speaker, Kalimion, a major contributor to the Odin language. So he's here to talk about community management for big open source communities and standard library language API design. Let's see. Hey, you should be live.
Hello. So I'm Kalimion. I've been working on Odin on and off for like 6 or 7 years now, I think. Shortly after the language got started, I dove in. And as Colin said, I'm here to talk about standard library design and how you can effectively run an open source community. And let's dive in. So when you're designing an API, it's a balancing act between ease of use, performance, and flexibility. But above all, you must maintain correctness, because if your API does something other than it's designed to do, then you've effectively got a different API. And you don't want that to happen. Ease of use is also, important. People don't want to have a very convoluted way of doing something relatively simple, and the
Absolutely.
convoluted.
So when you're thinking about ease of use, is there a package that you've done or that you've poked at that might be a good example there?
I would say, Core Image is
Core image.
a package
Okay.
that I started. And if you look at the PNG spec, there's the libpng library that supports all of the spec, but most other PNG loaders don't support the full spec.
Yep.
And it's a very over-designed file format,
Yep.
to say the least. Like it
So
has
you had some
single
trade-offs there,
channel.
right? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, there's single channel. There's single channel with alpha. There's 3 channels, and there's 3 channels with alpha. And then there's also the paletted option, and you've got like a background chunk that you can have an alpha channel that's either keyed, so binary, or alpha from 0 to 255. And it's also 8 or 16 bits, so it spans a lot of the possible problem space of images, and it's been over designed quite a lot.
Mm.
So in order to harness that in your program, that's like way too many options to think about.
Yeah.
For most problems, if you just want to throw an image on the screen, then you'd rather just have it returned like RGBA all the time. And if an image doesn't have RGBA, you just want it to have like an alpha channel that's set to opaque.
Right.
That's much more convenient. And then if you later want to have metadata to say like, hey, how many channels was the image actually?
Yep.
Then you can first query the metadata of the image and say, okay, well, it's 3 channels. Okay, so give me 3 channels and drop the alpha, or don't add an alpha, and you can save on bandwidth for the GPU transfer. And similarly, if you see like, hey, it's a 1-channel paletted image, you can tell it to also give you the palette chunk, and then do the palette expansion on the GPU. But those are, advanced use cases in a manner of speaking. Most of the time, you just want to do the simplest thing in the simplest possible way, and the API is designed to facilitate both. The simple path It's very straightforward. You chunk a slice of bytes at it, and it gives you back the image data plus some metadata. But it also has a couple of options that says whether or not to add an alpha channel if there's no alpha channel, whether to drop an alpha channel and blend with the background if there's a background, but you'd rather have an RGB image instead of an RGBA image, and so on.
Okay. Let's see. So, um, there's a couple of different cases here, right? You care about more advanced users, but primarily you're caring about your typical users, right? So, it's kind
Yeah,
of like the 80-20 sort of thing, right?
it's the Pareto principle.
Yeah.
We want to do 80% of the normal use cases that people find themselves needing in like 20% of the code to write a full-fledged solution. Because usually when you're getting into the more advanced use cases, they end up very specific to their problem. So even though it's the same domain, like they might need a very specific solution, and somebody else trying to do the same thing in the domain might want to have a slightly different specific solution. And that's also one of the reasons why we say, hey, here's the core library. We try to give you all the batteries that you need, but should you find yourself with a problem where you want to do something slightly different, the code is very legible. You can change it to your needs and go from there. It's BSD3 and it's very readable. So you
Hmm.
know,
Cool. All right.
and one thing I also want to highlight is that we have ease of use, as I said on the previous slide, performance and flexibility. And flexibility is what I said a moment ago about the PNG. It's a very simple API, but it's flexible enough to let you do the advanced use cases. And as long as that flexibility doesn't get in the way of the main use cases, you're doing a great job. But
Mhm.
above all, you must maintain correctness and then make it as performant as possible while adhering to your API design.
Right. So ease of use is an interesting one. It's kind of multifold, right? One of those, I think we talked about this in the past. One of those was consistency, right? So how do you name things? Um,
Yeah, exactly. That's part of ease of use as well. And it's a trade-off, right? You can imagine wanting to prioritize performance at the cost of ease of use, where you have to walk a document, and an easy way to do that is just chasing a pointer
okay.
to the next pointer to the next pointer to the next pointer. But constructing that document, that's a lot of single allocations that you're doing.
Right.
And you could also allocate like a free list ahead of time and then use indices within that that list
Hmm.
or array, which is like one big allocation, and then you're just assigning indices.
Hmm.
That's much faster, but you might want to write a helper function to let you navigate with the same ease of use as you would otherwise have by chasing pointers. So there's always a tension between performance, robustness, ease of use, and you can only pick so many um, frontiers to chase, right? While keeping down the number of lines of code you're writing and
Right.
doing it in a relatively finite amount of time as well.
Hmm.
But coming back to consistency, yeah, we do try to use the same kind of procedure names for the same operations, and we'll get to that in one of the next slides. And we also try to be consistent about parameter ordering. So if you're doing something similar, then you expect certain parameters to be in the same order and preferably also named
Oh, that's a major
clearly.
problem in C. Absolutely. You wind up with things like what order do some of the arguments in F-rate, or sorry, I think it's F-rate, yeah, F-rate coming through, or Calic, which one's the size and which one's the number of members? I don't know.
Yeah, there's just look at DD, the
Yeah,
command line
yeah.
tool. Like it's b size equals one, and its count equals 1024, or is it b size equals 1024 and count equals one? Like both work and both have the same result, but it's like okay, what's your block size and what's your count, right? And then there's like so many twiddles in
Yeah.
a lot of APIs, and if you can reduce the number of twiddles and they're self-explanatory by clear naming, and you have like examples in the comment above the API, like oh well, I need to call it with this um, enum member to do that, or
Mhm.
you know documentation. That's also something we'll come back to in a future slide, but it's yeah.
Documentation is a big challenge for a number of reasons. It's hard to keep up to date. It's hard to get an open source community excited about it, right? Hey, I want you to be the documenter. Ooh, that's a hard sell. But it is so, so important. Some of the projects that have done phenomenally well, like Rust, have a lot of effort done on their documentation side. Um,
Yeah,
so,
people get very excited about missing documentation, less excited about actually fixing the missing documentation.
yeah,
Or they'll get very excited about finding a typo, and they'll make a pull request for a typo, or just do an issue, and at the same time that they could have fixed it, they just pawn it off to you.
right. Yep.
So that's like yeah. Understand why it's not glamorous, it's not fun, it needs to be done, it's part of part of the work. And when you're a volunteer operation, it's not like you can excite people by paying them big stacks of cash to solve that problem.
Yep. But when you do find people that are excited about doing documentation or just do a little bit of it, it helps to try to keep them around as best we can. We've got some strong contributors in the Odin community specifically that have done some really good documentation work, and so much of the 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 love gets poured on them whenever it happens. Like, oh my gosh, thank you for doing this because you know, well, I could work on packages or I could document some of the basic stuff that's always there and everybody forgets to document. But yeah, for new users, it's such a big difference. Um, so
Like the
PHP,
slice package.
yeah,
Sorry, well, I want to jump in for a moment. Like with the slice package and the strings package, for example, have comments that are self-documenting code that are also run as tests.
hmm
So it says like, hey, you use this API in this particular way. This is the output that you'd expect on
right.
the console, and then the tests parse that out and unit test it. And yeah, the contributors that made that perfect, right? That's such a great thing.
hmm So yeah, I think you've got here, and I've also run into this myself. PHP winds up having some of the same kind of problems that C does. I think they tried to get away from it later in life, but they're kind of stuck with some of the early choices.
Yeah, it very clearly started as a thin C wrapper, and you also see that in the return codes in PHP functions. It's just like integers and
Yeah.
enums, and but C enums, like it's not like in Odin where you have an enum member that gets intuited when you
Right.
where you just have the dot and not the enum name. And like in with C, enums all live in the same namespace as the rest, and
hmm
it's a mess. And PHP also, you have things like a search function that takes a haystack and a needle, but another search function it's needle and then haystack. You've got the cryptically named string in string, and
So
there's like a lower sorry a case sensitive and a case insensitive version of it as well. So like try find it if you're not from a C background and you don't know that particular abbreviation already.
mhm. So one of the things that I've noticed that Odin has tried to do over the years and has been somewhat successful doing, is that kind of organic shuffle. It is taking advantage of the fact that it's not 1.0, and kind of allowed some of that organic growth, right? New users have come in and added things that they've needed here or there, and then there's a big sweep up pass that tends to happen. Um, I think there's some work that you guys have done recently on this. OS2 is a big example.
Yeah, that's this slide. We'll skip back to the previous slides. But in Core OS, we're trying to parse out what should be in the main Core OS package, and that's for things like opening files, writing files, reading their contents, and communicating with file streams.
Mhm.
So yeah, how do you do that in a cross-platform way? And that also involves the core sys package, and sys package are all of the bindings that communicate with syscalls or Win32 APIs and what have you. And each of those is different as well, right? So in Windows, you have your A variants and your W variants and your EX variants of APIs.
Yeah.
And if you want to use a Unicode name, then you need to use the W version and convert from UTF-8 to UTF-16 and then
Oh
pass it to
yeah.
Windows and then convert it back from UTF-16 to UTF-8. And it's a pain, but at the same time, they finally figured out like, hey, maybe people want to use UTF-8. It's only like 20 plus years old, 30 maybe at this point.
Mhm.
And so they're adapting the A versions of the API so that instead of ASCII, it'll take UTF-8. The problem
Mhm.
is that's only available on like the creators edition Windows 10 and later, so you cannot really rely on it. If you
Right.
say my software supports Windows 10, okay, which version of Windows 10? So you still have to use that W UTF-16 path just to be able to hit it. They just
Right.
left it way too late in the game to, you know. But yeah, that's one of those fun things as well, and that also needs like allocations behind the scenes, right? You want to open
Oh
a
yeah.
file and you need to convert the path, and so an allocation needs to happen for that UTF-8 conversion,
Hmm.
and you cannot really put it on a stack or have some kind of static buffer
Yeah.
because paths can be 64 kilobytes long or something,
Oh yeah.
so that's not something you want to put on the stack. You might up five, six, seven calls deep, and then before you know it, you've blown through your stack. So
What if I'm doing a directory walk? Ooh, right.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, what if you're doing a directory walk like 100 directories deep, and then all of a sudden, hey, Stack Overflow,
Right.
great. But you also kind of don't want to put it on the context allocator, and by context allocator, I mean the main allocator that you have in Odin. It's yours to assign a different one if you want to at the start of your program, or even somewhere very deep within your program you might want to start using a specific allocator.
Hmm.
But if we do all of that temporary behind the scenes work on that allocator, then you might end up with leaks that you forgot to clean up, or
Right.
if you're using a cyclic allocator, then that temporary work might override something that's still within the temporal scope of your program that you meant to use,
Hmm.
but it's now just been overwritten by that directory walk. So what we will what we're considering doing for the Core OS redesign is say like, hey, have a dedicated allocator, and any allocations you make from Core OS will use this allocator separate from the rest of your program, and then you just have the one free call in main at the end of all your work, and Bob's your uncle.
Yeah. Absolutely. So
But it does very much show that it's one of the oldest packages. So the existing one is very much written as needed, and it's a bit rickety, but
yeah.
it does what it needs to do.
Yep. So some of this is driven by kind of Odin philosophy, right? So Odin has made some choices that I think are non-standard, which has been driving how it's been steering the way that it's developed, how it's building its community out. I think we've talked about this before in the past. It'd be great to go over that. So, um, let's see. Behind my camera, my notes. So, a moment. Um, yeah. So, a big part of it, and we mentioned that earlier, was that try to cover 80 or to 90% of the community well, right? So, if you want to make a good library. A lot of languages will try the we're going to make something that works for everybody approach. I think C++ tries to tackle this, and other major languages do this to some extent as well. We're going to make a perfect hash map for everybody. Well, that's not always the right move. You might make one that's perfectly flexible, but wind up also with one that's not very good. Um, so that you kind of wind up with that trade off. Where does Odin fall in that category, that camp?
I think we try to do a kind of a bottom-up approach. We have our own use cases as the main contributors. Like it's a bit game specific, a bit, well, yeah, multimedia.
Mhm.
And so we try to think a lot about performance, low latency, memory usage, ease of use, because you're writing fairly large programs. So you want things to do the things you're looking for, and not all sorts of extraneous stuff.
Well, I think part of it is also the focus. The community's focus is on one kind of subset of applications. So languages tends to be tend to take the general first approach, right? I'm going to make a systems language that supports everything, or I'm going to make a scripting language that supports getting off the ground really quickly, but maybe doesn't wind up scaling phenomenally long term. Odin is kind of single focus, and it's not you know it's not mandatory single focus, but a lot of the dev effort, as far as I've seen, seems to be focused on application and game dev. A lot of the great work that I've seen coming out of little indie game devs and Django FX has been tools and UI building work, right?
Yeah, it did kind of start with the intention of being like a better C, and that comes with well, a thought like, hey, you should be able to use this as a systems development language. And people might be able to use it as a systems development language, and probably quite successfully so,
Oh yeah.
with a few stumbles, but that's not its main niche,
Well, I think
right?
vendor is
So
a great example of a place where Odin is winning, right? The thing that Odin has made really easy there is part of its major focus is trying to on ramp you into things like SDL or GLFW, or I think there's FFmpeg bindings, things like that, to get you kind of going quickly with or Raylib with rendering or getting a little application up and going as fast as possible. So it's not every battery included, but batteries that matter for the community that Odin is building, certainly.
yeah, it's a big contrast with Python, where if you look at Python's standard library, it seems to include batteries for literally everything. Like if you want to drive your Blender, then Python probably has like a third party package for it, right? And it's well, it's very nice if you need it, but it also feels a bit excessive. Its standard library is a bit bloated,
Mm-hmm.
but I've also found myself using Odin more and more for things I used to grab Python for, because it's very easy to just write a program that parses a file and munches the data and then
Sure.
spits it out again into a different file for like one-offs.
Mm-hmm.
That's stuff that I end up doing in Odin all the time now, because it's just like OS read entire file and then like an iterator to parse out the different lines and then do a thing, and
Yeah.
a lot of the same things you'd use Python for in the past, people end up doing in Odin. And then we even have people in the community that come from an F# background, that are used to munching lots and lots of data,
Yeah.
and that they find things running 5, 10 times faster, and they're like people can't believe it coming from the .NET community.
Yeah. So I think we talked about this a little bit already, but it'd be good to go into better detail, I think. Um, Package development. And Odin uses the word package. A lot of other languages will say libraries. Some thing that you can call into from other code. Some unit of code that is accessible elsewhere isn't meant to be written as the primary application. Um, how do those get developed in an open source community? How do you kind of steer people in that space?
Well, I mean, first we want to encourage people to be consistent. Like, are you serving a similar problem to something else that's been served already? And if
Mhm.
so, try to be consistent in our naming. If you're loading a file, call it load. If you're destroying the parse file, call it destroy. Use the same ordering for parameters, even if it's a completely different file format or
Mhm.
thing that you're doing. If you're working with data from a file, then it's load from file or it's load from bytes, or be consistent in the naming.
Right.
And then, yeah, how packages are developed, it's very just in time.
Okay.
Um, I needed a PNG loader for something, so I wrote a PNG loader. It was
Sure.
based on STB image, but uh, I went a bit further. I added the entire PNG spec.
Yeah.
Uh, well, just because I could, but also because it was fun. For some unexplored reason, I like file formats, and that goes back like 30, 40 years or so. One of the first file formats that I reverse engineered was the Dune to PEG file format,
Oh
which
yeah.
is a very simple, like this is the offset, this is the number of bytes, this is
Hmm.
the file ID, and then the data follows, right?
Okay.
It's your typical kind of file format, and like the TGA file format I also wrote a viewer for way back in the DOS time
Is
frame.
TGA almost a bitmap?
TGA is almost the same as BMP. It's a very thin header and then just a memory dump.
Okay.
And then there's like a flag whether it's bottom first or top first.
Right. Okay. So
But it's yeah,
okay.
it's memory dump from their video cards,
Yeah.
as far as I understand it.
So you talk a little bit about not wanting to support things you can't support. Right. I think TLS and HTTP2 were examples that you've used.
Yeah, like it's like when I wrote the PNG file format, and then other file formats have been added as well. Like I'm willing to support those. If somebody says like, hey, it can't load this particular PNG file, I'm willing to look at the bug fix.
Hmm.
And if somebody says like, hey, I don't mind writing an XLSX parser, but I'm not going to support it, well, then it's of limited use, right? It might be nice for
Right.
somebody to use it, but as soon as they run into a problem, we're not domain experts on the Microsoft file formats.
Well, and things like TLS change relatively frequently. HTTP is a bit of a mess as well. So it's hard to keep open source contributors actively maintaining a fairly big chunk internal to Odin.
And there are security implications, especially as well in HTTP2 and TLS. Like, even if you've got perfectly vetted code, then the ciphers that are recommended change
Mhm.
on like a regular basis, because, well, this cipher can now be broken in under a week on like a
Right.
supercomputer. We best start deprecating it, and before you know it, there's like some kind of advisory,
Yeah.
and you end up having to make changes to your package even though nothing changed. Like, wow, okay. But yeah, even when you've got people who know security very well. I know security reasonably well. Yawning Angel is another one of our community members who knows security very well.
Mhm.
But you cannot rely on us to write that code and maintain it and give you a certificate of, okay, you can use this in production code,
Right.
because it hasn't undergone third party vetting. So
Right.
some things you're better off just linking to
Yeah.
an external library that's undergone all that vetting and that has the financial support to put people on security full
Sure.
time.
So you talk about some of the ways that you manage that, right? I think this has been a sort of a meme in the community, but I don't disagree. You run into things like Conway's Law, right? As you get bigger projects, communication overhead, or bigger teams, communication overhead scales kind of um, exponentially. It's like n squared, isn't it?
Yeah, and Metcalfe's law is similar. So on the one hand, the bigger community, you can do more, and you'll have more people jumping in if somebody asks you a question, and that's all very positive. But
Mm-hmm.
as soon as you try to do something focused, like, hey, let's tackle core OS redesign together, well, you're better off doing that with 5 people. That might take longer to write that package
Right.
than say, hey, let's throw 20 people at it, because they'll be less focused. They'll try to work on the same thing. They might have difference of opinion on
Oh yeah.
how to name this certain thing or how to design this struct. And it's better to have a smaller team that each focuses on their own part of the package and has like some communication, like, okay, how are we going to tackle this? How are we going to tackle that? And if you have to orchestrate that between 20 people, you're actually going to take longer
Oh
to
yeah. Absolutely.
uh, to do the same work, and it's going to be less coherent.
We ran into that just doing the core net package. That was only like 2 or 3 people, and just the communication overhead on that alone was wild, right? Trying to make sure we were all in sync to get that actually shipped. That was quite a long process, but
Yeah, and
it made it
that's
out.
that's one of that's one of the problems as well when you're like a volunteer organization. Like, everybody has a life,
Oh
and
yeah,
you don't always have overlapping calendar openings.
absolutely.
So trying to find the time to communicate alone is its own thing.
Yep.
So yeah, hey, do you have
Well,
a spare hour? Yeah, I have a
yeah,
spare hour, but oh, I don't. Oh wow, that's sad.
yeah. Well, it helps. The core group is pretty good about getting together when there are things that need to get done with more than one person's input, right? Um, Most of the people that I've worked with have been very proactive. Like, hey, I need to get something sorted, and you're the point of contact on that. So let's make that happen. It's lucky that Odin's core group is quite that proactive, because I can imagine if it were not, it would be very difficult to run. But I think that kind of winds up being part of the healthy life cycle of that open source community. So you get those newbies in who want to contribute. They want to get involved, but they don't really understand the code yet. And then long term, as you start understanding that project, you move more and more towards the I've got an idea what things need to look like. I've got an idea what the code kind of looks like. Um, so you've had a direct hand in a lot of this, bringing people into the project. What does that look like?
Well, you've got self starters like I mentioned before, Yawning Angel, who's very good on hashes, security code, that kind of thing, and he just takes a look at, okay, what do we name things, which
Mm-hmm.
is like its own struggle always.
Yeah.
But once you get used to the way we name things and where things live, then, well, you have some people who just know the domain very well, and once they know the language and how we use certain idioms,
Mm-hmm.
then they'll just write an entire package by themselves, and then we have very small tweaks we ask to make them, like, hey, can you add a comment here, or maybe
Sure.
this could be an enum instead of an int, or what have you, like small things.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, people become long-term contributors, they develop the same feel for how we do things. And you also have your well-meaning newbies. They have a very specific thing that they want to see added, and they might make one single contribution. That's fine, but their one single contribution needs relatively more hand-holding.
Mhm. But that's just part of the process. Um,
That's part of the process. Everybody has to start somewhere. Like even Ginger Bill was at some point an Odin newbie, and he's the originator of the
yep.
language. So
Yep. Well, cool. So we start moving into Q&A here. We have a couple of questions, and I'm sure I can throw some more at you too. Um, here's a light and easy one. How many packages have you actually implemented?
uh, wow, I don't even know, and I've got like a couple uh, that are well half finished, three quarters finished, and I try to move between packages a bit
Yeah.
to keep the interest up. Like
Okay.
I'm working on a GIF reader. I'm working on
Ooh.
zip write support and zip
Hmm.
read support, PNG writing, and a few other things.
Right.
But yeah, you don't want to uh, get hyper focused on one particular thing, and then you start to run out of steam. And that's the same thing with like a well-meaning newbie who's passionate. You don't want to throw up too many roadblocks for them to
Sure.
make that first contribution. You want to make them feel welcome, right? And well, we say that a long-term contributor, they tend to end up committing a little bit more sporadically, but they're usually bigger
Right.
contributions.
So Odin has been moving towards 1.0 recently. I know that's been a big push. There's been a lot of things that we've talked about on like getting that roadmap looking good. I think we talked briefly about like adopt a package kind of models. We've talked about how to dole out that OS2 work because that's a big part of stabilizing core. Where do you really want to see things get changed and fixed and moved next?
Well, core OS is a big one. I also want to see a core process that allows you to like fork a child process, capture its
Oh
standard
yes.
input and output,
Yep.
pause a process, pause a thread. So you can use it for like either a terminal emulator, or you might want to communicate with the Stockfish chess engine,
Oh
or
yeah.
you might
Or the
want to
stuff that I'm
use it
doing.
for a debugger or profiler,
Yeah.
right? It's one of those things that's different on different operating systems, but it's also not impossible to present like a common interface for that that's relatively straightforward to use.
Yep. Cool.
So that's one terminal might be nice. You've got
Yep.
the NZ color codes. I'm
Oh
not
yeah.
saying like write an entire N curses clone, right?
You mean you
But
don't want an entire term cap wrapper?
no, but it might be nice to just say like, okay, this is clear the screen. This is query the width and the height of the terminal. This is output red blinking text on a white background. The the,
Hmm.
the basic
The
things,
basic stuff. Yep. That makes sense to me.
and
Yeah.
determine whether or not you're actually writing to an NZ terminal or whether you're writing to a file, stuff like that.
Right. So if I were a new person to the Odin community and I wanted to start getting involved, what's that process look like?
Well, it's we come back to this. It's very much on an as needed basis. You might look at an existing package and say, like, hey, this does almost what I want. Is it okay if I edit a Bytonic sort or what have you?
Hmm.
Or it's not supporting my favorite hash function. Is it okay
Right.
if I edit? And you ask either in Discord or you make a pull request, and then if we think it's suitable and not super obscure, then we'll edit if the code is good, and otherwise we'll guide you as to what good code looks like according to
Yep.
us.
Well, there's making new packages or adding new features. There's also fixing existing things. The way that I got into Odin was actually cleaning up things that didn't quite work on the platforms I was on. Right. There was a bug with the Linux build scripts for a little while. There was an issue with OS X reading or writing for a little while. There was some WASM stuff. All easy things to fix that made good on ramps. I'm sure there are more of those in there.
Oh yeah, I mean, we are one of the rare languages that is Windows first, and yeah, most of them tend to start on Linux. Some even on Mac OS, which is even more niche.
Yeah.
There's like 5% of developers that manage to contribute to your language. That's not a good place to start. But we started on Windows first because yeah, Bill started there first. I was developing for Windows
Well, if
and
you're
some
like
of
UI or game
the
tool
other.
focused, I mean, it makes sense to be there. That's where your tools are going to wind up.
Yeah, like the first adopters of the language were all familiar with Windows development,
Yep.
and some of us also use Linux. So became the second platform that had major support. But sometimes you run into parts of an API you're not used to
Yeah.
using a lot, and that's when things will run a bit better on Windows because it's the beaten path.
Right.
And then you come along and you say, "Hey, I want to write a profiler," and oh, now I need WASM support, and this doesn't work in WASM because like five people and their pet goat use WASM.
Well, it's been good though. I mean, it's been really valuable for Odin and me learning how Odin works to continue to run into issues and then kind of clean them up. Because Odin is getting more stable, and when things do get pushed that are like, we need some work here, it's not terrible to help build in tests. You need complicated enough projects to really shake out some of those issues. A lot of the weirder edge cases only occur if you're like, well, I'm using a map but in this weird context, or I'm using polymorphisms sort of strangely, right? Um, it's it's part of the language's growth, and things like that will shake out and have gotten fixed over the past few years, just because it's gotten more people.
Yeah, and when it comes to contributions, it might sound a little strange, but the hard problems are more fun than the simple problems.
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
something you can get stuck into, and that are really satisfying to fix
Hmm.
or to be the first to implement.
Yeah. Well, cool. um so um Odin is hopefully not too far out from 1.0. I think the last few big things in the roadmap are like that core OS change. There's the document that Bill wants to write, the language spec. There's been some kind of dotting our T's and crossing our I's recently, um, just to kind of get everything cleaned up and get that ready to go. Um, but I think it's trending in the right direction. It has been
Oh
a
yeah,
oh, good.
yeah, we've come a long way. Like, and it seems like it's taking a long time, but it's asymptotically
Well,
approaching.
it's growth takes a while, right? It's an exponential curve, and you started out at the slow part, and now we're starting to get that knee curve, right? It's been good.
It's also that 80/20 thing because Odin has been usable for a very, very long time already and it's been relatively stable. So people have started writing real stuff in it. I'm also working on a game that I didn't
Yep.
expect to take like 3 years or so before it sees, well, any market.
Yeah.
But, you know, I trust Odin to develop that in, right? And so that's
Yep. One of the
it's not just Jenga effects that's writing
right.
professional stuff in Odin
Well,
or you
Spall's
for
the thing that
that.
I've been working on that's in the same boat.
Yeah.
One of the future speakers is doing a really cool um, threaded input system for his game engine. The game engine is in Odin from scratch, and it's kind of fun to check in on where that's at. It's supposed to be an action RPG, I think. Should be coming up hopefully in the next 6 months or so. Okay,
Cool.
so it has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about kind of the Odin growth path and some of the interesting problems we've run into and where it's going. Um, I hope to see you around in the community. I will like give my hats off to you and to Bill and the rest of the folks over there. Let's see. Oh boy. So don't forget, we do have a jam coming up in a few weeks. I think it's the 15th again. Double check. There should be a link in chat if you scroll up. I will also repost it when I pop out here. Or join the Discord. I think it's. Let me see. I think Asaf can throw in a link there. But it has been great having everybody by. Stick around in April. I think we should have another speaker that I'm super excited about. I'll give you more details as we get a little closer. Thank you for stopping by.